James has a lot of great information for us today, a solid presentation. So as people are still trickling in, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Obviously, y'all can't unmute yourselves, but if questions pop up, we can throw them in the chat box. But also, James is going to leave some time at the end for specific questions as well. But I am Phil Nash. I am on the marketing team at Output Sports. I'm excited to be hosting this one today with our partner, Dr. James Malone, who is a basis accredited sports science and academic, the founder of Malone Performance, close to a 3 month anniversary from the founding date, which is exciting. But he has over 40 peer-reviewed research publications in football and sports performance, and he's going to bring his extensive expertise and his work mentoring, consulting professional soccer teams and practitioners worldwide to talk to us today about optimizing readiness in pro football. So, James, I hope I did the intro justice. I know you have a little intro in your presentation, but I will mute myself, hop myself, and let you take it away.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, mate. And welcome everyone. Thanks very much for giving up your time today to join in the session. I do have quite a lot of things to discuss or talk about today, so I'll try my best to keep it within the hour. And as Phil mentioned, we'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for questions. But if for whatever reason we do run out of time today, I'm always available after the session as well for any sort of questions that you have. So today is all about readiness. Just before we get started, I'll just do a quick introduction about myself. So for those who don't know me, I've been within the sort of football academic industry for about 15 years now in a number of different roles. So as a student, I'm from Liverpool, as the accent you can probably recognise. I did my undergrad at Liverpool John Moores, and then following that, I did also my master's. And it was during my master's year I had my first taste of football, of soccer, working at Everton. So I was a sort of 3, 4 days a week intern with the first team there. Following that period, I actually went to the rival team, to Liverpool, across the park, as we say. And I spent 3 seasons there working as a first team sports scientist. So I was full time with the club. But alongside that, I also completed my PhD full time. So essentially, I had 2 jobs, worked a lot of hours. By the end of it, managed to get the PhD just about. But yeah, the team weren't that great back then, to be honest. We were going through a bit of a transitional period. Certainly not as good as the team of today, to be honest. So either way, it was a really good experience. And then I had some offers to stay in football directly, but I also had an offer to work for Catapult Sport. So at the time, they were mainly based in Australia. They were looking to expand into Europe. So I essentially became their first European employee. So I worked there for 3 years, did a lot of travel, basically covered the entire area of Europe and the UK, myself and an Australian business manager. And then the team grew over the years. And these days, I think there's like 60, 70 staff running the whole office. So really cool experience to do that and to meet a lot of people within the industry. I then decided to go down the more academic route. So I spent the best part of 8, 9 years working in a university in Liverpool. To be honest, it was a good time for me in terms of just settling things down in my personal life because the previous 7, 8 years of PhD in football was a bit crazy. So that was good. But then, like I've described in my post today, actually on LinkedIn, things got a bit comfortable and a bit almost too easy. So earlier this year, I decided to go sort of full time on my business. So I now run essentially a mentorship type business slash consultancy. So number of different things I do, but essentially I work with both individuals and teams to either improve performance or help people with their careers in football. Okay, a little bit about me then. In terms of today, so the key objectives from the talk will be how we can look at sort of readiness. So this term readiness can be interpreted in different ways, but we're looking at how we can outline the fatigue process and how we can potentially use this sort of data to better inform what we do. I'm going to look and critically evaluate some of the common tests that we see within the football setting. And lastly, with all the things that I do, is to try and bring a practical sort of shadow and viewpoint in terms of how we can use it. So, firstly, just want to give a little bit of a definition around what readiness is. So, as I say, different people will interpret it in different ways. For me, it's the assessment of both the physical side, but also the mental side of preparation, whether that be for the training microcycle or it be the match day itself. It can potentially help us to avoid what we call non-functional overreaching. So obviously, as I'll come on to, we have different strands of that. We have the functional and non-functional, which is the bad one. So trying to prevent that where we can, and obviously overtraining, which is an even more severe sort of pathway when it comes to fatigue. And then lastly, readiness, it's not just one thing. So there's so many factors and different aspects that can influence your ability to be ready to perform on a given day. So a couple of the key ones there, but particularly training load, recovery, sleep, the pillars of recovery, um, even things like life stress, for example, all of those factors can play a part in your readiness. So, firstly, then, why is it important to collect this sort of data? So, you may have seen these sorts of reports that are coming out now by FIFPro. So, these are the players' union for all the footballers in the world. This is an infographic taken from one of the recent reports, and it just highlights really how the game is essentially becoming more demanding for players. So, we've obviously got in recent time increase in the way stoppage time is being managed. So we've obviously now got increased overall match durations through additional stoppage time. We've got an increase in competition. So the big one this year, obviously, is the Club World Cup, which will be in America. So essentially, that's going to really minimize both the off-season period, but then subsequently the pre-season for the players and the teams involved in that competition. And then things like the World Cup being in December, as it was in Qatar, all of these things are really putting a lot of strain on players, as you can see. And there's been quite a number of players now speaking up in the media to highlight potentially some of the welfare issues when it comes to the demands. But just to highlight this practically as well. So this was the fixture list for Real Madrid in the men's team for the whole month of February, essentially. And what you can see here is for every single week across that period, we've got a multiple game week. So there's no single game weeks in that whole period, in that mesocycle. Broken down, it's basically 5 occasions where you have 2 days between games, and then 4 occasions where there was 3 days in between games. So if you look at this particular snapshot in club football anyway, this is pretty much as hard as it gets. Obviously, international football is pretty much this anyway, but obviously you're only doing that for a month or so. But in club football, for teams like Madrid and all the top teams in the world, they have to do this, pretty much most months, especially if you're going far within your various competitions that you're involved in. And then what we're trying to do essentially with readiness data and support staff in general is obviously trying to optimize performance. We're trying to reduce our injury risk and we're trying to manage fatigue essentially. So these three key factors all interlink together. So with readiness in particular, obviously it's more so the bottom right hand side one, which is the management of fatigue, is what readiness is essentially trying to do. And if we can do that, it may then subsequently reduce injury risk and it may hopefully improve your match day performance when it matters. I think it's also important to note before we go into more the science, more of the cultural aspects in football now. So, a couple of articles that have been published over the years, but for example, two players here are now retired. So Frank Ribery and I think he's retired. I think he is anyway. He talks about having to be or being try and forced to have a cortisone injection for the World Cup. Steven Gerrard obviously had, well documented. He had many injections in his career, and he talks about having an epidural, which is typically used for pregnancy, for having babies prior to the big game against Chelsea. And then more recently, Thomas Muller, who's still playing for Bayern Munich, come out and said that, modern day players are soft, and he basically misses the good old days. So I think it's important because, in football, historically, there was a lot of pressure from people where you're having injections and you're forced to play, and the Roy Keanes of the world, people like this, very, very, very different culture. So these days, player welfare, as we've described, is becoming more at the forefront, and people are more aware now of the longer term potential risk of, essentially these gambles with your health when it comes to playing and readiness as well. But obviously, in a scientific perspective, the original sort of work which became really popular was obviously from Bannister, and it talks about the two concepts or constructs around training. So whenever we train or we do some form of exercise, we'll have a fitness response and then we'll have a fatigue response as well. So depending on the magnitude of that load, based on volume, intensity, and ultimately frequency as well, we'll have a different fatigue response. Typically, it's quite a sharp increase initially, and obviously coupled alongside that, we have a reduction in both our acute fitness and also our performance as well. So obviously in football, post match, we often see this typical response, this time course response, where particularly in the 48-hour period, we see this decline in performance and readiness. And then with the right amount of recovery, we're able to go back to baseline and essentially go back to performing how we should be. But when it comes to fatigue, there's not just one thing, as I said before, there's a lot of different concepts which we have to explore. The two sort of constructs, again, when it comes to the two sides of fatigue, is peripheral and central fatigue. So peripheral refers more to your localized musculature, um, things like muscle glycogen, which is often, depleted quite significantly within games. All of these things can influence fatigue both within the match itself, but obviously then subsequently post-match as well. But then alongside that, we also have the central component. So this is more derived from our CNS system, from the brain in particular. And it's something which we probably don't quantify as well as the peripheral system. It's only really recently we tend to look at mental fatigue and some of these concepts now. But, historically, we're very good at physiology, but less so when it comes to the brain and understanding the effects it has on football performance. And I think it's a bit of a strange sport, really, where we can often play despite things like fixture congestion to a reasonable extent. So this paper here by Ross Julian highlights some of the key literature around fixture congestion. And essentially, what we find with a number of studies is that players can essentially still physically perform most games. So there was a study in particular, I forget the author, who did a study looking at 3 games within a week. And even by the third game, the sprint output was just as, if not higher, than it was in game one. So obviously, you'd naturally expect our physical numbers to drop each game through the congested period. But yeah, footballers they're very good at pacing themselves. They're very good at managing fatigue as well within games. So what we find is actually, despite all this readiness and all this notion of the science, is that footballers generally do pretty well to cope with things. There was even an article by Chris Carling a number of years ago, which was a really interesting read. I'd highly recommend it. And he really did question, do we actually need readiness testing in football? So, for example, if we're in a 1 game week cycle where you've got naturally time to recover and heal and go again, do we really need it? And secondly, the coaches, the key stakeholders actually take this information and data on board. So it's not to say at this point in the presentation that we shouldn't use readiness, but certainly something to think about when it comes to the sport of football. So with readiness, when we try and fit this within the whole jigsaw and the puzzle when it comes to player monitoring, this very recent paper by Tim Gabbett provided this nice infographic where it talks about obviously your load So you've got your external and the internal load. But then in steps 3 and 4 here, it mentions about the two key readiness areas, so subjective well-being, and then also your objective measures of physical readiness. So in the presentation now, I'm going to talk about particularly these two areas, but just to highlight here really that it all feeds together. So the external load, the load that you actually undertake within a training session or a match, your internal response, something that we're not that good at quantifying in football. So heart rate in particular, we use in training, but not so much in matches. So, there is some issues there. But then obviously our focus today is that readiness component, which is from that previous load, are we ready to then go again? And I think again from the same paper from Tim, really important to highlight the different timelines when it comes to recovery. So again, within our body, within our systems, there's no singular time course of recovery. So if you do, for example, a low CNS stress type activity, so maybe it's an extensive aerobic day or type drills, typically you'd recover within 24 hours, within a day. If you're doing something that's going to really stress the CNS system, for example, an intensive anaerobic type drill, potentially then that's going to cause more fatigue, which causes increases the recovery duration to potentially up to 72 hours for some people. So really important that again, when it comes to readiness monitoring, we're not just looking at one thing because each of the different tests will tell you a different part, hopefully, around all of these different systems within the body. And then, what do the players think? Obviously, we can monitor these players with objective data, but there was a really nice study done by Volta de Salvo a couple of years ago where they provided quite a big survey study from the top 14 leagues within the European setting. And it was a very simple study. I think they literally had 2 or 3 questions on the survey, and it was just to find out when the players feel fatigued or tired. And for the majority, as you can see here, broken down by position, the key result was that it typically peaks at 2 days, so match day plus two. Some players, they felt it was at match day plus one. Some others with those clear bars, as you can see, would actually still have fatigue going into plus 72 hours, 3 days post. But as you can see, mainly with those black bars, we can see it's predominantly in that 48-hour period, which we need to concern ourselves with. So this infographic here by Jan Lemaire just really highlights that sort of uh, timeline, for a better word, or almost like a gauge of fatigue. So a lot of time in football, particularly in season, we will be hitting the sort of acute phase of fatigue. So, a match will take, 48 hours or so of recovery, and then we're pretty much starting our next microcycle of training or preparation for the next game. In pre-season, for example, where the match is less important and it's more about the load, we may then sort of reach into the other side of this gauge. So we go into more the functional overreaching stage where the athlete's being pushed. There's obviously quite a high perception of fatigue and potentially a short-term performance decrement. However, with a deload or with some recovery, we get that super compensatory effect, and then we see a positive change in fitness. Obviously, we want to avoid then going too far over to the other side where we go non-functional and eventually into the overtraining syndrome conundrum. I mentioned before about mental fatigue. So it's, like I say, not a new concept, but certainly when it comes to research, it's something that's only really starting to get some heat and some notice now. So this study here by Smith with Aaron Kutz's group showed in a football protocol that we do exhibit some effects or negative effects when it comes to performance. So the first thing is the physical side. On the left, we can see a reduction in yo-yo performance, yo-yo test performance. And on the right-hand side, this was a soccer passing test. And we can see again with the mental fatigue condition, we see a decrease in, well, an increased time, but a decreased performance when it came to passing. So This was obviously more of a controlled study, less real world, but certainly a really nice piece of work here, which was done by this group, and it really started to open up this area. This paper published, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, by Brett. This looked at a whole season's worth of mental fatigue data. So the authors basically looked at the visual analog scale and quantified that across the season. Um, Interestingly, they didn't find too much, so it looks a bit messy here, but it's quite varied as you can see. Some players on that table you can see on the left hand side, some players did exhibit fatigue, particularly later in the season, so late to mid phase. Other players didn't really find any effects really. So from this study, what we say is that essentially it's a very individual response, and potentially it could be down to number of games, how much travel you've done, individual circumstances, all of these things which can potentially influence mental fatigue as well. And of course, we have a lot of pressures outside of the game. So, something that's often overlooked is when people become a parent. So, whether you're as a mother or a father, it's a complete change of life. And, stories of footballers having to miss the birth of the children to play games and all of this sort of thing. And it's probably an area that people forget about quite a lot as well, is that they are humans as well as players. Social media obviously is huge and can have unfortunately a negative consequence when it comes to readiness and stress. Young players in particular traveling to new countries and cultures. Again, we often overlook that. Fans of the game will just be quick on social media to criticize people. Lads of 18, 19 who have gone to a completely new country and culture. There's just no time in football anymore to find yourself in the game. And obviously the fans as well. Fans, are now paying a lot of money to go to matches compared to years gone by. So there's a lot more pressure from the fan base as well on players. So all of these factors together lead into our readiness testing. And the first thing I really want to note is that, from my experience as a sports scientist in football, is you're almost seen as the bad guy when it comes to readiness. So bit of a joke here, which I'm hoping people get, but we're often seen as the guardians of play or of readiness to play. So it's almost seen as a policing tool as opposed to something that's there to help the player. So, the player may perceive you as using that data, having a secret conversation with the coach, and then not selecting them for a game or pulling them out of training when, for themselves, they say they feel fine. So I think it's a really hard concept to practically look at, and I'll explore this a bit more later in the presentation. Another important point as well is the what we call the touch points that footballers have to undergo. So this article, which is a great read by Barry Drust, talks about within a typical week for a player, how many touch points or points of contact does the player have with performance staff and medical staff. So you can see here across the various days in the week, we've got in the left-hand side the different types of test or contact that you'll have with a player. Things like nutrition is pretty much a daily thing that we'll obviously employ and try and get them on side. But for example, readiness will often employ that on a match day +1, +2, potentially, and then maybe even a match day +3. But you've also then got all these other things that are going on with the player. So when it comes to burden, which I believe is such a big thing as well, it's super important that the tests that we select are obviously easy to administer, but also we need to consider these touch points that we undertake. And I think another issue is that everyone just wants one number. We just want a very simple index or an accumulation score of what we're collecting. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. Physiology isn't as simple as a single measure or a score. So Whoop, which is super popular, a lot of footballers use it now, actually. Not going to go into too much detail about it, but the way people look at it is they'll look at that recovery score and they'll say, "Yeah, I'm 97% today. I'm good to go." But obviously, that score is only based on particularly heart rate, so heart rate variability and some of the sleep um, tracking that it does as well. It doesn't account for all of the other aspects of physiology. So again, we can't be as simple, unfortunately, to just have that singular number of readiness. So what we need to consider is the three pillars when it comes to readiness testing. Number one for me is the reliability of the data. So the concept of signal and noise in statistics is something that can be overlooked by practitioners. So, sometimes people will just look at raw data. So you'll maybe graph it in Power BI or Excel, look at it and say, well, that's gone up, that's gone down, and just, literally just subjectively interpreting some trends. What we need to do is we need to find out how much error there is within the test, both globally, but more importantly, within each individual as well. So being able to identify the signal from the noise is really crucial. The second aspect is around sensitivity. So you may have a really robust and reliable test. However, it might not be sensitive to changes in load. So if it doesn't go down after a tough match, then it's highly likely that it's not sensitive to what we need in football. And thirdly, is what I've mentioned already, is that burden on players. So a good example here is blood testing. So potentially it can be useful, which I'll come on to, but obviously that's a high burden monitoring methods because players, in my experience, don't like getting blood taken, whether capillary or venous blood. So again, you've got to consider that within the other two pillars as well. So what I'll do now is I'll just go into more detail about some of the common methods that we have in terms of readiness markers. This paper here by Marco Bito is a good one, a recent one. It's actually focused more on female footballers, but as it highlights here, these are some of the key sort of areas and topics that people will look at. And I've just added a couple in, so subjective measures, which is a big part of it, and also the biomarkers as well. So first one is subjectives. Obviously, when it comes to price, cost is virtually nothing. Super easy to administer. I guess the downside of this is that there's so many different scales and different things. And I think a problem that rises is that people will adapt the scales themselves. So an example of this, the Hooper scale by Sue Hooper, which is the bottom left-hand side one here, that has been validated within the literature by the group. But then people sometimes take that and they'll change the number on the scale, maybe shorten it or lengthen it. They will change the wording as well. And this is a big problem in psychology, sports psychology with questionnaires, is that if you start changing the original ones, then it does potentially lose that validity in terms of how you use it. So the two which I found are the most common are the Hooper scale or the adapted Hooper scale, which was by McLean. So that's the one in the top left-hand side here. That one is, in a way, a little bit easier because it's a 5-point scale. It does add an extra layer of in terms of the mood aspect of it. And typically with both of these, you will summate the score. So with the adapted scale at the top, typically the higher the score, the better. So the maximal score you get is 25. Whereas with the Hooper scale, obviously the higher the score, the worse that is. You want it to be low. The other side on the right here, you've got the VAS scale, visual analog scale, as I mentioned before. That can be good for monitoring mental fatigue with players. And then something else which is used as well is the total recovery, total quality recovery scale. That can be done as you can see here, a 20-point scale, or it can be more of a 10-point scale. And the advantage of that one is it's linked to RPE. So, for people or players who are used to RPE, they can obviously then be better educated when it comes to this one. If you want something a bit more comprehensive, these are probably the three most common. So we've got the REST-Q, which is there's two versions. I think one is 32 items, one is 76. So that can be good. It's a valid questionnaire. Downside is obviously time. So as a one-off, it's not too bad with players, but obviously getting them to do that multiple times a week becomes practically pretty much impossible. So This is why people often prefer the shorter form questionnaires like we had here on the previous screen. Oops. Other ones, the Dolder is another one, and also the profile of mood states. Again, some of these are a bit more generic and probably don't include things specific to football. But the good part of these, as you can see with the Dolder, is that it will examine other aspects such as life stress as well, which is interesting. In terms of the sort of reliability around some of these, so I'll focus more on the first ones. So with the Hooper index, what we can see here is generally, so there's different ways we can assess reliability. We can have, the absolute error, the typical error. We can have more as it represented individually, so as a CV percentage, or more represented as a group, which is more the ICCs that we have. But for example, here with the CV, we see Hooper is around about 20%. What we're looking for ideally is something 10% or below when it comes to applied data collection. So this is sometimes the issue, is if the players aren't educated or they're not used to this sort of subjective response and questioning, it can lead to erroneous data because essentially it is subjective. It's down to the player. Um, the good side of this is with the Hooper one, we do find it has good sensitivity. So we can see the study by Rubini on the left, which shows following a game, we see that, classic sort of time course response following a match. So post game on match day +1, we see the increase in the score, which is a bad thing. And then we see that time course of recovery going all the way to match day +4. And the other study by Mauler in 2016 shows the separate constructs of the scale, so sleep, stress, fatigue, and it also that and DOM, sorry, and then it also has the summated score, which I've highlighted there. And interestingly, you can see for DOMs and for the summated score, they have a better relationship with training load. So in this study, I think off the top of my head, it was relating to RPE. But you can see for sleep and stress in particular, they're not as well correlated with the response to the training load. If we use the 5-point scale, so the adapted scale from McLean, we can see again there can be a little bit of error associated. So here we've got the ICCs, so closer to 1, the better. For fatigue is actually the best one or the better one of the constructs. For the total score at the bottom there, again, that produces a lower error score, but still a lot of these are above that 10% threshold that we tend to look at. So yeah, again, similar to the Hooper scale, we do find some error, some variability there. What it does show when we look at it across the microcycle is again, post game, really good. It'll show the typical response where it obviously declines. It then goes back up when it comes to -5. Interestingly, with the muscle soreness one in particular, that was still showing some decline through match day -4 to -1, whereas some of the other scales, so for example, sleep, didn't show any differences across each day. So, this is where it can be useful because you can obviously have the summated score, but you can break it down as well. So particularly muscle soreness, fatigue are two constructs which, players understand and they can probably report better. Sleep is a lot more complex. For me, you need it more as an objective in combination with things like sleep diaries to get a real picture of sleep. Um, in terms of what it shows as well, so correlation with some of those metrics there with some of the key markers of training loads. Again, with even in this one, we've got some correlation with sleep, but fatigue and soreness in particular, again, is showing that relationship, a stronger relationship as well. Interestingly, with sprint distance, there was only fatigue, which showed any form of correlation. However, it wasn't significant. Now, with stress and mood, what we find is there was no relationship or no correlation between the wellness questionnaire and what we see from the match as well. So again, it gives some questions about some of the specificity of each of these different constructs. Okay, moving on slightly to heart rate. So heart rate is something that again is not a new thing. It's been around for a long time. It's something a lot of people use generally in football. Different things that we can look at. So very common now is heart rate variability, different ways and different measures for that. So we can look at the root mean square of the differences, the RR intervals, or we can do more of a natural log transformation with the data, which actually is better. We can look at maybe heart rate recovery. So whether that's using some max protocol, it could be, for example, part of a yo-yo test or doing a 5 minute fixed intensity on a bike and then measuring recovery, or a standardized protocol through training. And then lastly, resting heart rate as well, typically taken upon waking. So firstly, with heart rate in general, so Robin Thorpe, who's did a really good PhD on this area, so highly recommend his work. What we found with this one is that with the firstly the heart rate variability data, we find the CV percentage for the sort of general score, so the RMSSD, is around about 28% error, which is quite high, obviously. If we then use the log transformed information, the data, it does reduce that error down to around about 10%, which is actually not too bad. So first of all, yeah, very important point is that depends on which measure you choose. So for example, Whoop, I believe uses the first one. It doesn't use the log transformed data. So important to note when you're looking at different types of measures with heart rate variability. And then even for heart rate recovery, again, that was shown as less than 10%, which is always good. When it comes to the relationship, again, the sensitivity, we find that same study from Rabini. We see that classic response. So this again was the log transformed version. And we see on +1 that decline followed by the recovery process. There is some work again in Robin's work where there was a small relationship between high intensity distance and the heart rate variability scores. But to note, it was only a small magnitude when it came to the subjective interpretation there. Something else that's become quite popular, obviously, is trying to use standardized drills or some maximal tests to look at the fatigue response. And for me, this is a really interesting area. There's some good studies coming out in this area. Um, More so for me as a fitness measure. So using it to monitor, for example, aerobic fitness, I think it's got more benefit there as opposed to as a readiness marker because, even with a standardized drill, so if you've got a standardized warm up or technical drill or something, which you try to standardize, there's naturally going to be some variability there. So, for example, looking at your ratio between external internal load is something people tend to do. Again, there's some data showing that could be something to look at, but for me, there's probably not enough evidence just yet to really hang your hat on that particular one. And even in the green here, it talks about looking at GPS data, so particularly the accelerometer, to look at your neuromuscular status. Again, some studies showing firstly good reliability in that area, but also then potentially as a fatigue marker. For me, yeah, some interest in it, but there's probably not enough weight in the literature just yet to say that's the way to go. So as I say, for me, this is more as a fitness monitoring strategy as opposed to purely a fatigue or readiness strategy. Um, when it comes to heart rate recovery, one thing we find, firstly, well, both of these studies from Robin, firstly, is that across different types of days, there wasn't any change really. So whether that be post-match or across the training microcycle, we see no difference. And then secondly, when it again came to that relationship with training load, so high intensity distance, we found there was no significant relationship there between heart rate recovery and the changes there. So again, some question marks there around whether it's a useful marker. especially compared to heart rate variability. Resting heart rate, there's probably not as much information out there when it comes to as a readiness marker. So, as I've highlighted here, it's again potentially a good marker of fitness. So, as we know, if your resting heart rate is lower, it indicates particularly aerobic fitness can be a good thing. Players will often have a resting heart rate lower than 60. So typically about 40 to 50 in most players. Um, Obviously, there is a little bit out there on its use as a readiness marker. So in particular, this study here, which shows some increase in resting heart rate following the game, and then it goes back to baseline at match day +2, essentially. But again, there's probably not as much supporting evidence out there for the use of resting heart rate as a readiness marker anyway. Potentially as a fitness marker, but not so much as a readiness marker. The next sort of category is around biomarkers. This paper here by Harless talks about how we can use different layers of biomarker monitoring for players. So particularly this bottom one here, so monitoring recovery is what we're concerned about today. We can use bloods and saliva for things like screening for health. So, taking venous samples at different time points in the season to monitor things like vitamin D status, for example, is super important. We can maybe look at things like lactate as well, done so more in endurance sports, less so in football. But yeah, for us, we will typically want to look at certain markers when it comes to recovery response. The thing with biomarkers is that there's a lot out there. These are just some examples, but again, physiologically, we've got different systems and different ways to respond to exercise. So, for example, we've got things that we'll typically look at for muscle damage. So things like creatine kinase, for example, which is probably the most popular in football. We've got our sort of hormonal difference and change. So testosterone, our stress hormone, and cortisol. Sorry, the other way around. Testosterone and then cortisol, our stress hormone, and looking at the ratio between those two things. And then we've got our immune response as well. So things like IgA, which is commonly measured through saliva, and things like white blood cell count as well. I don't want to go through all of these biomarkers today because I've not got enough time, but just to highlight a couple of things. So, particularly with CK, so CK is highly variable. So this paper by Russell describes the variability for some players is up to 35% game to game. As it's typically only measured post game as well, can be hard to find trends because obviously games will differ. We published a paper quite a few years ago now where we looked at the relationship between across the whole season between the match training data, well, load data, I should say, and the 48-hour response of CK. And we found absolutely no relationship between CK and any of those key match variables, as you can see in the table here. IgA, again, is something which is used, particularly in the UK and your colder countries through the winter. It can be a useful marker just to potentially flag any illnesses that are coming up on the horizon. This study by Ryland Morgans, however, didn't find any real change or difference in both starters and non-starters when we look at before the game, going up to the game, and then obviously all the way up to match day +2. Ryland and a few others in that area, Adam Owen, has done some work in this, and there's a bit of research to show it does, it is suppressed with increases in training load sometimes, but again, similar to CK, there's a lot of variability into variability day to day and time of day as well. There's definitely if you take it in the morning versus afternoon, for example, or if you're hydrated and you versus not, these sorts of things can really influence the data. And just to give a little shameless plug, but I did write an article last week for my free weekly newsletter where I did talk in more depth about CK and is it actually worth using in football. So definitely check that one out. And then things like testosterone, cortisol, I mentioned before. This study by Amber Rowell looks at, again, time course response. We see your classic response really. In this study, we've got low, medium, and high load players, and then we can see there's a bit of a dose response type effect when it comes to the different loads. But pretty much by 24 to 48 hours post, everything goes back to normal. So, very, very similar to things like CK. Yeah, it's very much a time course thing. We're obviously going to get damage, we're going to get changes. It's just whether that relates to our load and our differences there as well. Now, a big area which is used a lot is obviously jumping. There's a lot of different tests out there, so I'm going to stick to the ones that are most common. So counter movement jump in particular has probably got the most attention, and the use of drop jumps as well is another one which people tend to use. Now, firstly, with the reliability aspect, we see so this study by John Fitzpatrick, he looked at this was in elite academy players actually. So across the things like counter movement jump, squat jump in this example as well, and then drop jump with the different components, so contact time, jump height, and reactive strength index. What we can see here is that the general reliability is pretty good. So for particularly counter movement jump, actually just looking at jump height is a pretty solid measure, and we see this across a number of different studies. As we go down, we can see with the RSI, it does increase our error somewhat. And this is something I found as well, is that there is a learning effect when it comes to particularly drop jump. So counter movement jumps are a little bit easier to coach or to show. Whereas if a player or particularly a youth player isn't used to a drop jump test where you have to obviously, you know, fight against gravity to jump back up, it is a bit of a learning effect. So something to be really careful of, I think. So in this example, the CV is obviously okay, but you might find with your players the CV is quite high because they're just not used to that sort of test. So I would always recommend a lot of familiarization before starting to interpret the data properly in terms of meaningful change. With CMJs, so jump height, we do find some mixed results. So bit of an older study now, but in female players, this study by Peter Kustrup shows that immediately post game, there was actually a slight increase on average in jump height, possibly due to potentiation of the muscle following the game. But most studies that I've seen anyway, like this one by Silver, will show a decrement at least at 24 hours post, if not longer. So some players it can be up to 72 hours post. More commonly, it's more in the 48-hour window. But particularly 1 day post, it's definitely we see a decrement in jump height. With the link here, when it comes to correlations again, so this study by Robin, we can see with counter movements, we've got a small but significant relationship between high intensity distance in training and matches and the changes in counter movement jump. RSI, which again is super popular, something that I know a lot of the output sports users use quite a lot, and it's potentially a really good measure. This study again by Fitzpatrick shows that for the sensitivity, which obviously is one of the key pillars that we're looking at, we can find across all the different jump types, it's actually arguably the best one. So as you can see, counter movement at the top shows some interest when it comes to the MBI, which is the magnitude-based inference. But as we go down, we can see squat jump is unclear. Drop jump, if just look at contact time, is again pretty much unclear. But if we look particularly at the height of drop jump, and then when we look at RSI, we find that the signal to noise ratio is acceptable. And also then it's sensitive to the change in what we're doing as well. So for me, yeah, really good test. Again, if the player is familiarized properly, you're going to get some good data. It's a really good one, and obviously with output, it's super easy. You just strap the device to your shoe. No fancy equipment needed. Get yourself a box or plates, and then just do your drop jump test from it. Sprint testing is an interesting one because it's one that people will potentially use more so in research, less so in practice. So we've got our linear tests, so our different sprint tests. We've got repeated sprints, and then we've got our GPS derived sprints as well. With the linears, we find it's generally good when it comes to reliability. So CV percent again can be between 0.5 all the way up to about 11%. With our repeated sprints, it becomes even better actually because we're obviously assessing multiple sprints as opposed to just a single one. But yeah, most of the time, especially in linear sprints, is a pretty solid measure because again, most players have undertook that as part of the testing battery, so they are familiarized. Again, in terms of sensitivity, we find that it shows the classic response. So particularly in the immediate effect, we see a drop of about 2 to 9% in sprint performance. Obviously, there's different lengths of the test, so whether it's 20-meter or 40-meter, there can be differences there. And the same for repeated sprints. Some protocols will have 5 by 30 or 6 by 20 and certain rest periods in between. So a lot of difference in protocols, but in general, we do find that we observe the classic sensitivity response. Big issue though, I think, with sprint testing is just the danger because obviously getting players to sprint maximally, especially as a readiness marker, is a risky one without a proper warm up. So some people now are starting to use more the GPS, so trying to do invisible monitoring to do it that way. But again, it's a solid measure. There's a lot of studies showing that it can give you some reliable data, valid and reliable data. There's quite a few studies now with different systems. Um, could be used during the warm up potentially. So if you do some, build up stuff and then you maybe throw in a couple of sprints within your warm up, potentially you could look at the live data. But downside of that is obviously then you've already started your training week essentially if you're on, say, a match day -4. So the time to react to that data is obviously minimal. Another way to do it is if you do it pre-training and you do it as part of the activation. But again, potentially a good marker, but practically maybe not so good. Strength testing, there's a lot of things to cover, so I've just tried to highlight the key ones really. So isometrics we find quite popular is the hamstring isometric test, whether it's at 30 degrees or whether it's at 90 degrees, so typical variations. And what we found with this study from Alan McCall is firstly very good reliability, both on the dominant and non-dominant leg. And then secondly, the sensitivity to change. Again, it's very sensitive when we provide a fatigue and stimulus. So, for this one, typically you'd use a force plate, a portable force plate, something like this, but it can be a really useful marker, which is easily done as part of a readiness testing battery. Isometric mid-thigh pull, get my words out. Again, this is popular mainly as a strength test, I guess, but can be used also as a readiness test by some people. Again, this paper by Vincenzo Rago shows the reliability of the test, and it's pretty much spot on for a lot of things. The time-related variables, so rate of force development, for example, that's where it becomes a little bit sketchy. But for your general, peak force, things like this, it's pretty solid with the CV. Not a lot of data in terms of readiness testing when it comes to this particular one. This study here by Oliveira did show that there was no difference pre to post game with the mid thigh pull. But for me, this is an area that probably needs a bit more exploration. And I would personally prefer more of the hamstring type approach because if you think about it, that's where a lot of the muscular fatigue will generally come from when it comes from players post game. And of course, VBT, which is obviously very popular with the output sport system. Not to go into too much detail on this today, but some practitioners do use this for auto-regulation. So when you're doing your gym sessions in particular through the week, it can be used as a way of self-regulation where you can adapt the load based on different velocity and different bands that you can potentially use on the system. So again, it might help in terms of just understanding that readiness aspect of when you're doing particularly your barbell lifts in the gym, and just helps to manage the gym load as well. Okay, I'm gonna have to rush through this a little bit because I realize the time's a little bit short. So last little bit to the presentation is interpretation firstly. So as I said earlier in the talk, a lot of people make the mistake of just looking at the numbers, the raw data. That can be an issue because we don't know, is it a meaningful change? Is it a true change? So there's a bunch of different ways statistically you can look at the data, but for me, for the majority of practitioners, just keep it simple. This paper by Turner, which is a really good one, talks about different ways you can potentially have this sort of zone around your data. So the example we've got here shows counter movement jump height. It shows for that player, the error is about 2.5%. And then what we can do is we can create these upper and lower bounds around that error. So in this example, we've got 7 jump heights that have been sampled across time. And of 6 of the 7 of those fall within the expected noise or error of the test. Whereas at time point 4, that is obviously fallen below what we'd expect. And that's only really when you can flag and say, that is a true potential meaningful change in our data. Other ways to look at it, obviously the Will Hopkins smallest worthwhile change. So whether you go zero point 0.2, which is quite narrow, as you can see here. So to pick up a change there, you're going to see a lot of things. So it's probably more ideal to probably widen, the potential sort of noise there. So moderate change, which is 0.6, or large change. You can actually also do very large, which is 2 times the standard deviation. Um, you know, different ones of these. I'd probably go with more the large, to be honest, if it was me, just because that's going to give you more of a realistic viewpoint when it comes to interpretation. But then practically, how do we look at it? So within a microcycle, so let's say this is your perfect week in a way. So you've got 2 games, well, 1 game a week, but 2 games. You've got 6 days in between. Both games are at home, so you've got no travel aspect to it. When do we test? Well, as Chris Carlin said, maybe we don't need to test at all because naturally they should recover and then be able to train and play. However, if you're being more of a scientist in a sense where you want some data and you want to make sure that they're ready, um, it makes sense to test in the immediate aspect. So let's say they're in on a +1 where they're doing some recovery. Makes sense to test them here where we know then what's the magnitude of the fatigue. Um, the other side you might look at is maybe then just prior to the upcoming microcycle, so going into the next week. So here it would be -4. So are they ready? Have they recovered from the game? Another point here is maybe after your big loading days. So in this example, it's -4 and -3. So prior to -2, some people have that as a day off, by the way. Maybe testing there to see have they recovered or how much fatigue are they carrying into the last 2 days of the microcycle, obviously then prior to the game itself. It becomes trickier when we're obviously testing in congested periods. So in a way, this is where it becomes more important to test readiness, to look at, selection strategies, rotation, injury risk, etc. But in this example, as you can see, we have a game. First game is away, later kickoff. Next day is a day off. So the coach has said the lads or girls are away. So that means there's no testing. So then the testing is on the Monday. So that'll be, your plus match day +2. You've then got a -1 light session, play the game. The second game is at home, but again, a late kickoff. You've got the next 2 days in, and then your third game, which is away. So the day before is a travel. So when we look at the differences when it comes to measurement, so if we were to take these 2 testing points, we've got test 1, which is approximately 37 hours post-match. If we do, say, a morning assessment, test 2, which is roughly about 15 hours post, which is, if the players reported in the afternoon after the nighttime game. So just to highlight, really, when we say things like +24, +48, it isn't quite that simple. So it's actually more the exact hours post. And obviously, the difference between 15 and, say, 35 hours is quite a lot when it comes to fatigue monitoring. So I think this is something that's maybe overlooked sometimes, but it's also important to note when you're looking at your data, think about the exact time from the game and also then the context around it as well. Pre-season is obviously something where we can push the athlete. Again, this is where readiness testing can be really useful, potentially useful. So we can obviously then look at particularly the heavy days. So in this example, we've got 2 days within the week, which are doubles. So you've got maybe a big session and then maybe a bit more of a lighter tactical session in the afternoon. Um, Obviously, we want to get into a functional overreach state within this example. But again, readiness in this scenario is a good way to just make sure we're keeping on that fine balance between being functional and non-functional, which is what we want to avoid. And then the practical conundrum, which is, when do we intervene? So I think this is a big issue because we often, let's say this is a normal day, we often arrive in the morning, quite early, 7, 8 a.m. Players will report a bit later, maybe 8, if you're lucky, more likely 9, if not 9:30. Training might be 10:30, 11. So we actually don't have much time. So if this example on a match day -4, we don't have much time to actually, um, get the players in, test them, and then make a decision prior to training because often coaches and medical meetings will occur before the players arrive a lot of the time. So again, for me, this is a practical issue when it comes to readiness testing is do we have enough time to actually conduct the test and then, make sense of the data and then subsequently change or modify the training? Um, an example here of something where we could potentially collect some data and make some informed decisions. So let's say we collected three different types of tests. So a subjective measure, so the adapted Hooper scale. We collected some heart rate variability data, and then we collected some drop jump data as well. So each is telling us something a bit different. Of those tests, we've got some individual CVs. We've got a baseline as well. We've got that range of error. So then we've got our readiness score, and then we can see the current status for each one. So in this example, we've got 2 out of the 3, which have been sort of red flagged as an issue. Um, there's no hard or fast rule to say if 2 out of the 3 are bad or 1 out of the 3. This is where experience and knowledge comes into play. But for me, that would be certainly worth, a conversation. So that conversation could be with the player, where you then, either present the data or just discuss it with them informally, and then try and get some information from them. So they might tell you that they're still tired from the last game. They might lie to you and say they're completely fine because they don't want to get dropped. So this is sometimes the issue. Obviously, then you go to the coach as well and you say, yeah, spoke to the player. Player said this. The data tells me this. This is what we think, and that's where potentially can modify and change the planned load for that given day or week. Like I said at the start, we don't want to be seen as police in this regard with readiness. So we need to be able to, modify things subtly without being seen as the enemy by the players. So drill modifications, whether that's changing the role, so might be going from an active role to more of a feeder, someone who's just on the periphery but still involved. Could be to reduce the number of sets or reps of a particular drill. So if you do small-sided game, I don't know, let's say 4 times 4 minutes or something like that. Maybe they only do 3 lots of the 4 minutes, so they get removed from the last one. Which again becomes tricky with coaches because obviously it's on player numbers, but something potentially you could look at. And then the last resort is removing from drills. So whether that be, remove them from the last drill, which is often the most intense drill. That's something that if you really need to, could happen as well. Okay. I've kind of rushed through that. I do apologize if I've spoken rather quickly, especially with my accent. Just to summarize though, so with readiness measures, as I said before, we're ideally looking at a CV percentage or an error rate of about 10%. And obviously that needs to be ideally performed on each individual player in terms of that testing. So alongside that, it needs to also be sensitive to change, as we mentioned earlier. We also need to quantify that across the season. So, for example, you may conduct this during pre-season. So let's say you did it for drop jump in pre-season with a young player, you get a certain CV percentage, but then because they're conducting that test across the season, they essentially get a learning effect, so they become better as a result. You then need to repeat that reliability testing at least a couple of times a season, and then obviously update your interpretation based on the latest CV percentages. Ideally, you want to use readiness across different things. So I showed you that example earlier where we had three different types of tests, and each one is telling us something a little bit different based on physiology or subjective versus objective. However, the last point is be really conscious of player burden because this is one thing I see in a lot myself is you kind of just keep adding and adding and adding to a player's demands with monitoring, and unless players see an actual insight into the data, they're going to lose interest. So in an ideal world, you'll just choose things that you know will make impact, they're reliable, they're sensitive, but then that communication aspect as well is super important that the player understands why we're collecting it and what we're actually doing with their data. Okay, that's me. So thank you very much for listening. There's my email as well and my social media handles. So if you want to drop me a message or get in contact directly, feel free to do so. But not sure if you've got any time, Phil. We are a little bit over. If you've got any questions.
You're good. Yeah, no, I mean, I have time. So if you have like 5 minutes here, we can throw some questions in the chat box if anyone has questions. And if no one does, I definitely have a question or two after going through. So if you have a question, throw it in the chat box. Um, for me, I guess I can start with a question. One thing that I do a ton. I use the 10-5 RSI test for myself and for the handful of athletes that I work with, just because it's super easy on output software and you don't need a box or anything. You just press go and do it. Would you recommend saying the drop jump and the RSI on the drop jump being sensitive to fatigue? Could you sub in the 10-5 RSI test in place of that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of literature on that one. Not as strong, I would say, compared to
Okay.
drop jump. So historically, there's a lot more information we have available about sort of reliability in these aspects. But as you say, I think the downside of drop jump is if you don't have the right box or equipment at hand, especially if you're out in the field and you just want a quick, easy test. So for me, the 10-5 is an interesting one. I think
Mhm.
it still needs some further, research in particular to see if it's reliable. But with output in particular, as we said before, it's super easy to just
Yes.
strap it on and next minute you're aware you've done the test, it's on the app, and I think that's a really big part of it is just that super quick, easy access to that data. So
Yeah.
as I say, for me, as long as it's reliable, then yeah, I think it's
100%.
potentially a useful measure.
100%. And then I have a question from Mark Jesse. Is there a standardization of heights for the drop jump test?
Good question. No, in a short answer, there isn't really. So if you look at the literature, there'll be different boxes used, different heights, whether it be, 30 odd centimeters, 40s.
Yeah.
It really does vary quite a lot. So um, like with any test, I would say, Mark, is to just keep it consistent. So in your gym, if you only have a certain height of box, as long as it's not either ridiculously short or too high, then I think just as long as you keep that consistent is the key part. As soon as you start changing height, then all of your historical data will obviously be changed, and you have to basically start again.
Yeah. I like it. I like it. Well, for everyone who jumped in late, don't worry. This is being recorded and it will be sent out to everyone some point tomorrow. So if you registered, you did, you're here. This recording will be sent out. It's going to be posted to our YouTube channel. You'll be able to access this whenever you want. And if anyone else has any questions for James, his email is down there at the bottom. And you can shoot it over to him. And James, you have time. One more just trickled in if you have time.
Yeah, I just saw that one actually from
Yeah, yeah,
Philippe, wasn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, an interesting one actually. as I said before, really, the mental fatigue aspect is in its infancy when it comes to research. So, someone I'd recommend looking up is Susanna Russell, who's based in Australia. So, she's done some really cool work in this area. So, the VAS scale I mentioned before, which is, you know, technically a subjective measure, even though it gives you an objective number. Um, that is probably the best practical way at the moment to use in the field. Um, Measuring mental fatigue as a lab setting is a different kettle of fish. So you can obviously put on, you know, I forget the name of them, those fancy little helmets where they've got your sensors and your
Yeah.
different things, ECG type stuff. So
Mhm.
that would be the objective way. Under different scenarios, you're going to measure brain function. But obviously in football, that's not practical. So as it stands, VAS scale, I would say, is the way to go. But I do think in the next few years there will be more tech and there will be more things start to come out in mental fatigue. And like with anything, we get new fancy shiny things, and we then need to, as boring scientists, test the reliability, validity, and hopefully then be able to use it in the field.
No, no, yeah, it definitely seems to be an area of the field that is absolutely booming right now. But
Yeah.
all right, well, James, thank you again for your time. This is incredible. A lot of great information here. For everyone who joined, thank you for jumping in. If you ask questions, thank you for asking questions. And yeah, no, this has been a blast.
Yeah. No, thanks very much again for the invite, Phil. It's great to share this sort of stuff with the audience. And as I say, I'm always very open to discussions with people. Just because I've said all this doesn't mean it's right, by the way. These are just my thoughts and feelings. So always nice to chat with practitioners and coaches about different approaches, the way to do things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. 100%. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, rest of your week, and hopefully see you all on the next webinar next month.